Good morning. My name is Dr. Kumara Ward and I'm from the University of Dundee. Good morning. My name is Dr. Kumara Ward and I'm from the University of Dundee in the School of Education and Social Work. Thank you so much for having me at your International Conference for Social Studies and Humanities in Malaysia 2021. I only wish I could be there in person, but of course the pandemic makes that impossible. I look forward to hearing more about the conference, but in the meantime, please find my recorded presentation. I'd be more than happy to engage with anyone interested in finding out more about the research that's being reported on here. But until then, thank you. Today I'll be talking about inquiry arts-based pedagogies and experiential nature education for sustainability learning in early childhood. The research I'll be sharing with you today is called Inquiry Arts-Based Pedagogies and Experiential Nature Education, or IOPEN for short. In today's presentation, I'll be covering the policy and the practice context, the theoretical context of the research, the rationale for arts-based thinking as nature connection and sustainability learning, the genesis of the IOPEN research project, the sites that I visited internationally, the aims and the methodology of IOPEN and Stage 1 outcomes and Stage 2 outcomes, and the conclusion. In this presentation, I'm seeking to respond to and to frame my understandings of the human and other than human worlds through research that includes dynamic perspectives generated through the arts. What originally began for me as an anthropocentric view of connection to nature through theories such as biophilia or ecopsychology or even deep ecology can be turned around to look at the agency of nature. In other words, looking at the interplay between humans and the other than human world. This is embodied in this slide through the image of the waves crashing into the rock and turning into aerated foam that becomes a different state where the influences are combined and where, through a gentle realism, we can see new possibilities. The arts, of course, are a wonderful way for us to perceive these new possibilities. And arts as daily curriculum in early childhood and the sustainability education are a wonderful way in which to engage children with the natural world and with the other than human worlds. In this research, art is combined with content about the natural world into the daily program and creates a synergistic curriculum for sustainability education learning. The IOPEN research project was carried out in Australia in 2016 and 17, and the regulations that were in place at the time were the policy and practice for the National Quality Standards for Early Childhood in Australia. Standard 3.3 indicates that the service must take an active role in caring for its environment and contribute to a sustainable future. The elements that come under that standard include element 3.31, sustainable practices are embedded in service operations, and element 3.32, that children are supported to become environmentally responsible and show respect for the environment. Out of the 18 standard, this particular standard 3.3 was the second highest standard that was not being met by all services across Australia. It would be reasonable to think that implementing education for sustainability in an early childhood setting is a little more straightforward than at other levels of schooling. However, some of the issues that were identified were that those who were assessing the services had limited knowledge of what was involved in implementing sustainability education. The Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority, or ACEQA, also recognised this, and they implemented additional guidance for sustainable practices and environmental responsibility in early childhood, including aspects like intentional teaching for young children and for out-of-school hours care services. Critical reflection, children's agency, challenge versus were also included in their additional support measures. The National Quality Standard embodies and considers that we belong in context. In other words, we come into a world where we already belong, to a family, to a community, to a society, and we then engage in the process of being and becoming. Outcome 2 of the EYLF tells us that children are connected with and contribute to their world. Element 3 of Outcome 2 says that children become socially responsible and show respect for the environment. Now, it provides examples for educators to assist them in their practice. It says that educators work towards these outcomes by providing children with access to a range of natural materials in their environment, by modelling respect and care and appreciation for the natural environment, by finding ways of enabling children to care for and learn from the land, by considering the nature of children's connectedness to the land and demonstrating respect for community protocols, and in particular by embedding sustainability in daily routines and practices and looking for examples of interdependence in the environment and discussing the ways the life and health of living things is connected. And they are of particular relevance in the research that I am reporting on today. Unsurprisingly, there are a number of barriers to implementation as identified by Sue Elliott and Julie Davis. In particular, in Australia, it's often thought that outdoor play opportunities are more than enough with children at home and at school. However, play spaces are being eroded. The nature of our suburbs often means houses take up most of the building plot. In schools and early childhood settings, play spaces are also being reduced to allow for additional teaching indoor spaces. Time is also limited for children to engage in self-selected play in the outdoors, so recess is being taken away because there is a perception that real learning occurs indoors. It's often considered that the need for learning outdoors is mitigated by technological advances, but we know that children need the outdoor time and that genuine nature connection occurs through spending time in nature. Another key barrier is that often it's thought that sustainability issues are too complex for children. However, children do have a right to engage. We all share the same water and air. Children are capable and active learners. We share the common world, and the world that we will be passing on to our children is one riddled with crisis at the moment. The time spent in the natural world with capable adults predisposes children toward environmental thinking and stewardship. So they need to understand what's involved in the challenges that they see in their communities. They need to have a sense of hope and optimism, and they need to have agency in what happens in their environments. A final but quite powerful barrier that is also often considered is that nature is often silenced because much of the theory or the post-structural theory in the early childhood field, which focuses on issues such as language, gender and power, and these discourses often silence the role of nature. It has no voice of its own and therefore is very difficult to theorise and to use for educators in transforming this into content for their programs. However, if we learn to listen and then tell the stories of nature, if we learn to move and flow and to sense ecologically, if we learn about interactions between states, we can start to identify a common voice. So why the arts and nature? What is the rationale for art-based thinking as nature connection and sustainability learning? The arts help us to recognise the forms, colours, movement and agency of nature. Nature makes us feel and act in certain ways. Through the arts we can recognise the common worlds. Eisner tells us that the qualities of experience are relived, refelt and reconceptualised through the arts. They have the capacity to engender affective states, cognitive understandings, and to engage the will in action by their very nature. You can see here the sense of movement inherent in the glass sculpture as it reflects the river, becomes an inspiration. The arts help us to embody place. Through movement, drama and play, we perform the other than human world. This can be viewed as representation of place through Karen Barad's performative relationalism. This is a way of knowing through doing and action, instead of the normally prioritised conceptualisation and interaction with matter through language. There is a knowing that comes from this kind of movement that makes one think differently. This slide shows representations of the natural world through sculpture. You can see in the top left-hand corner the bird's eggs in a nest. To the right we have starfish. Middle left we have what the children interpreted as ducks' nests. We have fish in the bottom right and also the bottom left corners, sculpted out of beeswax. Here Skylark the scavenger is drawn. But in order to draw this picture, the student needed to know what it was that the bird was chasing, what sort of food it wanted, and what its habitat was. One of the iconic representations of the other than human world is the rainbow. Understanding the rainbow goes to the heart of the relationship between light and water. And of course, colour and form can generate a sense of awe and wonder. Our knowledge of our environment is known through colour and form. Our moods are affected by colour. Full spectrum light is known to be less disruptive to children than regular fluorescent light. The magic of the rainbow here is captured by a 4-year-old boy using 3 colours only. It was very much a process of exploration and wonder. Form and proportion in the other than human world are also inspiring. The physical correlations between the human and non-human worlds can be incorporated into mathematical connections in primary or high school curricula. Engaging with the natural world through the arts and through biomimicry can be incorporated into the curriculum and into our understanding of being part of the other than human world. In 2015, I set off on a journey to find practitioners who engaged with the arts with the specific intention of incorporating them into sustainability learning. I visited international early childhood settings, elementary schools, public green spaces, community non-government organisations, and also universities in Australia, in the US, in Canada, and in New Zealand. This is a unique early childhood centre called Te Mirumiru on the North Island in New Zealand. Whereas on the previous slide, this building looked like it was part of the hill, reflecting the hills around it. On the inside of the curve, you can see that it's light-filled and reflecting forms of the natural environment in which it's situated. The inside has a more intimate and protected feel, reflecting proportions and light and forms that children might create themselves in their cubbies. But you can certainly see the influences of the arts in this architecture. This is Taiki Early Childhood Centre. You can see there are paths that curve They have different proportions. They go under bridges. There are water features. There are plants that have different sculptural qualities, all of which are representations of using creative, artistic landscaping. This is a great example of artistic interaction with space. This is at Dimensions Preschool, and you can see they have incorporated children's footprints into the making of the bricks. There are organic forms in the seats of the bricks above. The pathway is made of broken crockery turned into a colourful mosaic. Each tile in the mosaic on the left was created by the children in response to being asked to create something about the natural world that they liked. This wall is in the yard of the Ruth Staples Child Development Lab in Nebraska in the USA. You can see in the brickwork here they have imitated the skyline of the city. And this is interesting insofar as it is a reflection of place, and it is a privileging of an environment, namely a cityscape, that is not usually considered worthy. But here it is very much part of what the children see as part of their daily experience. This is the same early childhood setting, indoor and a couple of outdoor images, and what they're trying to do is to reflect the history and the interaction between the human and other than human worlds. The little house with the cars around it represents a house on the prairie, and the gardens around it contain the wildflowers that would grow in the prairie. There is also a forested area. Inside, you can see the design of the space is inherently artistic, and this is achieved by using natural materials and aesthetic colours, forms, and textures for the children to experience. Here, elementary school children in Canada talk about their concerns for the environment on a series of clay leaves that have been fired and glazed and hung in the foyer of the stairway at the University of Toronto Education Department. This collage was created by undergraduate students at the University of Toronto, each of whom created a clay tile identifying elements of the environment that were important to them. This collage hangs in the train station underneath the university and highlights the importance of the natural environment. It's a great example of environmental art in a public place. Also, at the University of Toronto in the Education Department, the Fatal Light Awareness Project took place. These images were created by the undergraduate students, and they were copied onto special contact which was stuck beside light switches in the building to encourage those who were leaving the building in the evenings to turn the lights off. The reason they encouraged this was because the birds were flying into the windows thinking that it was still light or still daylight even, and many birds were dying as a result. And finally, and still in Canada, in Toronto, I visited the Evergreen Brickworks in the Don Valley. The sculpture you're looking at here represents the river systems of the Don Valley as they flow into the Don River. The Evergreen Brickworks is a repurposed industrial site that now contains many spaces for groups in society to use, ranging from environmental groups to education groups, to artists and, of course, higher education students. It also contains public markets where the public are invited to come and enjoy the facilities on a regular basis. It has a range of different spaces for different age groups and different cohorts, and here you can see the elementary school children's garden where children can come and plant and build and play and learn about all aspects of growing and environmental troubles and treasures. So having seen so many wonderful examples of the arts being used to reflect the natural world and to incorporate it into learning for all age groups, I set about the IAPIN research project. The aims of the project were to correlate the perspectives of an international group of educators who work with sustainability education and the arts, to analyse the synergies between sustainability education and the arts through contemporary post-humanist approaches, particularly in relation to human interactions and relationships with the natural world. To develop a series of recommendations regarding sustainability education relevant to the early childhood education sector that supports the implementation of relevant and accessible early childhood education for sustainability and overcomes many of the current barriers with regard to sustainability education for this age group. To engage in a pilot program in Australia and Lincoln, Nebraska, USA, to validate recommendations arising from the analysis of the international perspectives. The research engaged qualitative methodology, so it was interpretivist and inductive. Stage 1 in open-ended interviews, photo elicitation and photo stories. The analysis focused on the constant comparative method of Korber and Strauss and Glasser, and also in searching for patterns of similarity and difference to identify common themes. I used in vivo for the coding. Stage 2 engaged inductively oriented practitioner action research with case studies reporting on the correlations between the applied IAPEN recommendations and the outcomes of this by the educators in the two countries. Stage 1 included 30 interviews with early childhood educators, elementary school educators, community educators, and those working in environmental programs in non-governmental organisations. There were interview transcriptions for every interview conducted, a series of photo stories. There was participant reflection and validation on the interview transcripts and on the draft analysis. And the outcome of this work resulted in a series of principles, reflections, and practices. Throughout the interviews, the word econnection kept coming up. Econnection was describing the multidimensional scope for connection with the other than human world through the arts. It's defined by a feeling of interconnectedness with the other than human world through a combination of the senses, through our cognitive faculties, through affective domains, so how the natural world makes us feel, through our dispositions, our ecological and cultural connections, through the interrelatedness and embodied interaction and well-being when we're in a green or natural world space. So the word econnection comes after each of the principles, or each of the headings of the principles, the reflections, and the practices. There are 8 principles for econnection, 8 reflections for econnection, and 8 practices for econnection. I'm not going to talk about all of them because time doesn't permit, but I'll highlight just a couple from each of these categories as an example. So you can see under the principles we have 1 to 6 on this slide, and the others will appear on the next slide. As I mentioned before, there are 8. So in number 1 it says we are part of and made of the same materials as the earth and all the elements of the natural world. Our bodies are biophilic in nature. In the description it says human beings are part of the earth and evolved from the earth. We are part of nature and nature is a part of us. We all breathe the same air and require food to survive. Number 4, there is a psychological effect that relates to our sense of being and belonging when engaged in the natural world. In the description, it goes on to say that frequent experience of a place, for example, a landscape, a green space, can bring a sense of belonging and assist in restoring mental faculties and engender a feeling of well-being. And you might see some links here to things like attention restoration theory or ecopsychology. And indeed, this research builds upon those theories. Now we come to reflections. Let's look at number 2. When engaged in a green space, make a conscious note of the types of lines, forms, and colours you can see. In the examples, How many different greens can you see? What forms and shapes can you see in leaves, rocks, clouds, and mountains? What is the relationship between straight lines and curved lines in your view? This is a good example of how the arts are integrated into the thinking and the reflecting process here. Number 4 highlights the post-humanist element. When engaged in a green space, be aware of your own and the children's bodies in the space and the ways in which they are interacting. Consider the effect other humans have had on the space. If we look at the example, it says, what does the space entice you to do? Smell the flowers, run your fingers through the water, climb a tree or slide down the hill, sit on a big rock or make patterns with the seed pods. What impact does your presence have in the space? The final 3 reflections, let's look at number 7, for example. Consider the ways the human elements, buildings or other constructions blend with or complement the natural world, or the ways in which the natural world has been used to complement them. In the example column, it says, how do the structures work with the space? Do they complement it, blend in, or look somewhat out of place? How do the natural elements affect the look of the structures? Are there gardens or vines growing beside or on them, or trees shading them? What might the designer of the space have been thinking? And now we come to practices. Let's look at number 2. Watch and listen for enrichment moments that arise when a child engages with a feature of the outdoor learning space or green space. Respond to them through conversation, questioning, creativity, and enthusiasm. In the example, it says children notice their environments. A question about a train of linked caterpillars can generate ongoing program material, including investigation of habitat, viewing life through the eye of a caterpillar, in other words, you could develop stories, and looking at their relationships with other species. Visual art, drama, music, and movement are all useful modes of exploring these elements. At number 7, provide natural materials for the children to use that invoke different landscapes, natural phenomena, animal species, and relationships. Now this one's aimed obviously more at younger children, but elementary school age children also learn a great deal from this kind of engagement, indeed this kind of play. In the example, it says include seed pods, shells, driftwood or bark, and leaves of various kinds in the loose parts available for art and for play. Consider items for provocations of particular landscapes. For example, cuttlefish husks, shells and driftwood arranged on a blue sea-evoking cloth. Explore their provenance and create stories about their possible history. You can see art, natural sciences and sustainability education all rolled into a single activity in that example. During stage 2, the principles, practices and reflections, having been finalised through review by the participants, were formulated into a document and sent out to 2 early childhood settings in Lincoln, Nebraska, and 6 in Western Sydney. The early childhood educators used the document in 2 ways. First of all, they used it for their own reflection and generation of curriculum material on a daily basis, and they also used it to identify what they saw happening with the children and their own exploration into the natural world, and to try and put some theoretical clothes, if you like, on what they could see that the children were learning. You can see here from the Nature Explore classrooms in Nebraska, there are drawings of the cherry tree. The educators had identified IOPENE Principle 6, where form, colour, sound, movement, touch, smell, taste, relationships and awe are the basis of creative artistic expressions of the natural world, which facilitate deeper multimodal knowing about ourselves and nature. You can also see there had been engaged in practice 6, whereby they were revisiting and building on elements of experiences in the outdoors through all art. At University of Western Sydney Early Learning Centre, you can see that the educators have identified IOPENE Reflection 5, which says when engaged in a green space, try to see or imagine which animal species live in the immediate area and what the space might be like through their eyes. And as they've written in their reflection here the children connect with nature as they visibly watch their seedlings grow, remove old leaves and weeds that surround their seedlings, construct homes with this compost for ants and small insects that live within the soil. So they're caring for and constructing homes for the animals and the insects that live in the soil. IOPENE Principle 7 was also identified through this creative activity. IOPENE Principle 7 says the integrated, embodied, psychological and emotional interconnection between human beings is deepened through artistic appreciation, engagement and expression. And in their insightful reflection on this principle, they have said that children explore nature as they recreate outdoor environments using natural resources in the classroom. They have the opportunity to recreate moments or sceneries which they have previously experienced while enjoying outdoor adventures. So for a period of 3 months, the educators at the 8 sites observed what the children were doing. They used the principles, reflections and practices to guide their implementation of their programs on a daily basis, and they also used them to help them understand the meaning that they were making from their experiences. Here the educators have identified IOPENE Practice 1, which says take children into the outdoor learning spaces at the early learning setting and to green spaces beyond the setting gate as often as possible. Now in this case they've taken that into their own environment, their immediate outdoor space, and looked at what was in the environment that they could reuse with their sustainability hats on. And you can see here they've identified a piece of wood, some old broken chairs, and some handles from bikes that were no longer able to be used. And combining their resources, they have created a wonderful train that the children are obviously very happy to play in. The educators at Western Sydney Early Learning Centre in the Hawkesbury created this record. The children arrived in the morning to find that a clutch of ducklings had hatched. The mother duck had been nesting in the tree for some time, so they were eagerly anticipating the hatching of the ducklings. The educators identified IOPENE Principle 2. Engagement with the natural world affects us emotionally, and the body and the senses mediate this effect. Now there's no doubt that the children were very excited, but they were also in awe and reverence. And with this, the educators identified IOPENE Principle 3, which says there is a psychological effect that relates to our sense of being and belonging when engaged with the natural world. And here the children were very aware of their own space in the natural world, in the outdoor setting of their early learning centre, but very careful to make sure that there was also space for the mother duck and her ducklings. In addition, the educators identified practices 1, 2 and 3. Practice 1 relates to taking children into the outdoor learning spaces as often as possible. Practice 2 talks about watching and listening for the enrichment moments that arise when a child engages with a feature of the outdoor learning space or a green space, and respond to them through conversation, questioning, creativity and enthusiasm. Well, this opportunity certainly lent itself to interactions that involved enthusiasm, questioning and creativity. Practice 3 talks about observing how the children interact with the space in an attempt to identify the meanings they are making from the interactions, to provide experiences to enrich and extend their understanding. And this may mean taking action as much as letting the children be. to engage on their own. This is one of many records that the educators took of the interactions with the mother duck and her ducklings over a period of about 3 weeks. There were opportunities for discussion, for reflection, and for allowing the children to just observe quietly. The IOPEAN principles, reflections, and practices were used in the early learning settings for a period of 3 months. At the end of that time, the educators made a series of reports on how they had engaged with them, how the document had assisted them in their generation of curriculum material, and how to help them to identify and to theorise and therefore to build on what the children were learning about the natural world. It was helping them and the children to connect with nature in a manner that they hadn't identified previously. And connection with nature is something that my colleague Alex Barrable is going to be talking with you about in the next session. But until then, I'll leave you with the words of visual ecologist Aviva Reid, who was one of the participants in stage 1 of this research project. Through the combination of immersion in a naturescape, complex ecological concepts, and an arts-based exercise, a symbiosis of pedagogies has an opportunity to occur. Through the process of creative insight, a deeper visionary state can be induced, encouraging meditative and visionary opportunities, extending and deepening our scientific literacy and eco-vocabulary beyond that which is logical and language-based. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello. I am thrilled to have been invited to deliver this presentation at the International Conference on Social Studies and Humanities 2021. It is an honour to be included to present some of my work alongside many esteemed colleagues, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to also watch others share their own work. I'm Dr. Alex Barrable, and I'm a lecturer at the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Dundee in sunny Scotland. My main area of research is indeed nature connection in childhood, and I will be sharing some of my latest publications in this field. We are lucky here at Dundee to have an excellent team that works on closely related fields, including Dr. Kamara Ward, who is also presenting, and are working together on topics such as nature connection, but approaching them from different epistemological and methodological approaches offers excellent opportunities for collaboration. Each of our perspectives offers a complementary approach to this complex and relevant topic of education for sustainability. So today I will pull at one strand of some of this work, and I hope that it brings together the key elements of why I believe we need to put nature connection at the heart of education for sustainability. This talk will be simple in structure, quite straightforward, and hopefully clear in content. I want to share with you what nature connection is and why we need to put it first, but also what we know from years of studies and what we still need to learn about the way that it relates to pro-environmental attitudes and behaviours. I will then go on to share the how. What do we innate? Do we all have it? Does it come with contact, or is there something more complex at play? Following that, I would like to explore some of the work we have done here at the University of Dundee that brings together theory and practice. Some studies that explore the way we connect, and also an overview of the literature. I will close with some next steps, hopefully inspiring some of you to take action in a variety of settings. However, before I start, I want to touch upon the limitations of this research. The work I will present is strictly positivist and post-positivist in nature and has limitations in what we can learn from it. There is little depth to be found, and we're looking here at relationships quite generally operationalized and simplified. Also, I need to note at this stage that most of the studies I'll be referring to are based on a Western population. The ones certainly that I have done are on European adults and children. And I should say that I'm very open to collaboration to explore other populations. So please reach out if you wish to do so. I'm going to share my details at the end. Now, overall, nature connection is a psychological construct that describes a feeling of belonging to the natural world, of being a part of it rather than apart from it. It can describe either a state that's momentary or a trait that's more longitudinal in nature. So a state is a transient feeling. I am right now feeling close to the natural world, while a trait is something more stable over time. Nature connection is subjective. Basically, it is about how one feels, and this is something that is sometimes seen as a criticism of the field, but I want you to consider how most psychological constructs are subjective. In fact, most cognitive and affective events are, from the way we perceive colour or pain to how happy or sad we feel. And we can still measure most of these fairly accurately. And the way we do that is through self-report. Now, most constructs of nature connection have many dimensions, including cognitive, affective, and behavioural ones. Basically, they relate to how we feel, think, and act in the natural world. Just one little note here on terminology. There are many terms that you will see in the literature, and although they're not actually synonymous, they have subtle differences to their use. It is important that we distinguish between them. I personally use nature connection as an umbrella term that brings together all of these terms, but different terms represent different constructs and operationalizations. For example, inclusion of self in nature represents a singular and very specific unidimensional construct on how much you feel you are one with the natural world, while nature connectedness has cognitive and affective factors as well. Human-nature relationship is, again, a much broader term. It can describe both positive and negative relationships with the natural world. And I also know Kumara uses the term e-connection, and she mentioned it, I think, in her presentation earlier. Now, research from the last 15 years suggests that nature connection is positively associated with greater acceptance of self, including both physical and psychological aspects of the self. Vitality, meaning how alive we feel, how energetic we are. It is also linked to several types of well-being. For example, affective well-being and eudaimonic well-being. Now, although correlations are small to medium, they're comparable to that of education level, marital status, and level of income, which I think is quite important to put into context. Also, very importantly, they have been found to be positively associated with pro-environmental and pro-social behaviours. Now, looking at this particular aspect more closely, there is mounting evidence to suggest that nature connection can be a driver for pro-environmental behaviours in both children and adults too. In a recent study, nature connection is reported to explain 69% of the variance in ecological behaviour versus only 2% explained by environmental knowledge. And a recent large meta-analysis of over 13,000 people showed a significant and positive correlation between pro-environmental behaviours and nature connection. We have also had a series of experimental studies that have also seen that causal relationship. So, given these robust associations of nature connection with different types of well-being, but also, and for this presentation very importantly, its links with pro-environmental behaviours, it really makes sense to put nature connection at the heart of education and see it as a distinct goal of the educational process at all levels. At the heart of this is the drive and motivation for change. Now, with the climate crisis as a very likely focus for national and international policy for education in the next several decades, and with behaviour change being at the heart of what we will be asked to do, both at a personal and a societal level, highlighting this motivator, in this instance our connection to nature as a goal for the educational process at all levels, is the key to achieving meaningful change. So how do we do it? I often say that just as we do not connect to people simply by riding on a busy bus, we do not connect to nature simply by being around it or in it. We're talking about building a relationship, and as we all know, relationship building takes time. It can be effortful and it requires commitment, but it is a worthy goal. In the past, contact has commonly been seen as synonymous to connection, but the complexities of our relationship with the natural world are becoming elucidated thanks to hundreds of researchers and practitioners around the world engaging in reflective practice, questioning norms, and trying to discover how we come close to the other than human world. Some of my early work brought together elements of environmental, social, and developmental psychology to build a theoretical framework that would enhance nature connection. Although based, as you can see at the bottom, on sustained contact with the natural world at its very core, the framework tried to go beyond that. It focused on three core elements: compassion, beauty, and mindfulness. Compassion, or its precursor, affective empathy, Compassion, or its precursor affective empathy, with the other than human world, plants, animals, and inanimate nature, can be cultivated from a very early age. In fact, it does not even require contact, although immersion in the natural world can create the right conditions. Gardening, looking after plants and animals in any context, can spark empathy and start building this relationship. The move from the specific, my pet, my plant, my garden, to the general, our world, happens gradually, and it happens when it's developmentally appropriate. In a recent study that we undertook with colleagues here in Dundee, we looked at the relationship of childhood pet ownership and subsequent nature connection in adulthood. We found a substantial and positive relationship between the two, moderated by the amount of time spent looking after the animal, feeding it, cleaning it, or walking it. We also looked at children's pet ownership and current nature connection in childhood, and we also found a positive relationship there. So it seems that pet ownership in childhood has an effect on how connected one feels with the natural world. Noticing beauty in the natural world is the second element, and it comes in many guises. There are several studies coming out of the University of Derby and Professor Miles Richardson's group to show that noticing the beauty in the natural world is much more important than simply contact in terms of building this relationship. Our own research here at the University of Dundee, we also did a study to look at how technology can impact on noticing beauty in nature and our nature connection. And this particular paper was published in 2020 in Digital Culture and Education. What we did was we had two randomly assigned groups take a walk in urban nature with the instructions to notice 3 beautiful things. One group had to simply note these. The other had to take a picture on their mobile device. We then compared the changes in nature connection scores in the two groups. Now, both groups had a similar positive change. Noticing the beauty in nature meant that the connection to nature went up. Mobile photography neither hindered nor enhanced this effect. However, at follow-up, after 3 weeks, the group who had used their mobile device mentioned that they had been more likely to engage in this activity again in the following weeks. So noticing beauty in nature can have a positive effect on our nature connection, and it seems that using technology does not hinder that effect. And then there's the third element of mindful engagement, the act of being in the moment, engaging with our senses in a non-judgmental way. Many studies in adults have suggested a robust effect of mindful engagement on increasing our connection to the natural world. In one of the first studies to quantitatively look at mindful engagement and nature connection in children, we followed 75 9 to 10-year-olds visiting a nature reserve in Wales. We found a positive effect on both nature connection and positive affect, that's feelings of happiness and joy for those children, and a drop in negative affect, which is feelings such as anger, worry, or shame. The problem is that studying our connection to nature is really very complex. There are hundreds of factors that affect it, and those change throughout the lifespan. In an effort to map out these factors, in a recent study with Adriana Moskovchakova from Erasmus University in the Netherlands, we reviewed the ever-growing literature on this topic. We actually found more than 30 factors, and we split them into groups. On the one hand, we had internal factors, and these were those that came from within the person. And they included dispositional factors such as perceptual sensitivity and cognitive style, affective factors such as self-reflection and emotional awareness, and demographic factors such as sex and age. We also had external factors such as experiential ones like time spent in nature and autonomy, and environmental factors like residential setting and neighbourhood vegetation. Central to all this, and neither internal or external, were familiar factors such as parental connection to nature and family values towards the natural world. However, how these factors work together is the next challenge, and it's a little bit of a mystery because there is certainly a lot of complexity in these relationships that cannot be captured by this simple figure here. I'd like to think that there are certainly implications for all practitioners when designing and delivering education programs with an ultimate aim of change of behaviour. In my opinion, effective factors such as promoting a relationship with the natural world need to be at the heart of these programs. Keeping in mind and using some of the elements that I presented today could facilitate that. Having said that, there is a lot of work to be done. And from my point of view, I would love to see longitudinal studies to explore how our connection to nature changes across the lifespan, or in fact not. Another area of work I would be really interested to engage in would be looking at more diverse cultural and ethnic populations, whom we already know have different relationships to the natural world, and elucidating how they develop this relationship and what we can learn from them. I want to leave you with this thought. We shouldn't just focus on what world we're leaving for our children, but also on what children we are leaving for our world. Many of us in education need to heed this message and take it forward into our practice. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Please, this is my email address. Reach out if you would like to collaborate or ask questions on anything that I presented today. Thank you.
Hello, hi, I am Dr. Nur Faradilla Muhammad Nasri. Currently, I am Deputy Dean of Faculty of Education, University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Thank you for inviting me to this conference, and I am very happy to share my experience as well as my opinion. particularly on preparing students for sustainable lifelong learning challenges. Okay, assessment. Assessment is something that is extremely central, and it is fundamental to what we do as educators. And there is nothing more powerful in influencing what else students do and how they do it and what they learn and what we do in assessment and feedback. So nothing is more important. It doesn't matter what your lectures are. It doesn't matter what your courses are. It doesn't matter uh, how you teach them, but what is more powerful influence on our students is how we assess them. And our assessment tells the students what we really care about. And if you really don't care about your assessment, you will not be able to change it. Okay? So, what is non-negotiable in the way that you assess them? It means particularly significant to the students. So, what I would like to do in this presentation is just to explore and to share what David Bouts has said about some issues and in assessment. And I would like to highlight that my understanding of the role of assessment in teaching and learning is greatly influenced by David Bouts' suggestion on how assessment can be used as effective educational tool to support students' learning. And to follow this trajectory, I would like to suggest that some of the existing understanding and practices about assessment now, especially in the university, is very problematic. And we need to rethink what assessment is and how we do it. And strangely, our assessment greatly influences our other practices. Let us think about the question. I also want to peer into the future and to think what kind of graduate that we want to produce. And I want to suggest that we both need initial as well as continuing practitioners that can learn and can generate when we were not there, meaning that the students themselves can generate, can learn, can relearn, although they are beyond formal educational institution. Another thing that I want to suggest is that the problem we got is not the shortage of the assessment method. There is an enormous way of how we can assess the students' learning. But if you look beyond that, it doesn't take too much looking. It's very easy to find an enormous list of good assessment practices. That is not a problem at all. The problem is how we conceptualize assessment to produce productive learning. And what I want to emphasize is that it is not only important that we get assessment to work for learning now, but most importantly is that we need to get it work in the longer term, in the future. And I have my doubts about some of the things that we take for granted in the way we do things, that rather actually build the students' capacity to be learners in the longer term, we are taking away that opportunity from them. and I want to see if you could find whether there is any way looking at the assessment not only as a process imposed to the students, but it is, of course, how the students can react when they receive the assessment. And of course, this way of thinking will cause a lot of implications. So, where should we start? I think we should admit that assessment, as we know, it has failed us as educators, us people that is interested in having influence on students' learning and building students' learning in desirable ways. I think what we tend to do with assessment is that we are trying to drive compliance, not initiative. We want students to listen to us. We want to foster dependency by learners on assessors and on being assessed. This is fundamentally dependent situation. Do we want to produce workers that depend on the leaders to show how to improve themselves? So I don't think so. If the worker behaves like that, they are not going to be in the company for a long term. So, how we create this situation? I think what we have done is that we set up assessment that is backward looking. We are looking at what has been achieved and what, rather than what is needed to be achieved. So we have a retrospective of view of assessment. It's backward looking. So rather than building confidence, I think we are making our students fearful. So it depletes capacity rather than it builds capacity. So I wonder how we reach to this state. Why are we taking our eye off assessment, collective as it is? Our view about the assessment concept is very underdeveloped. So one of the issue that we got is the issue of fixation. Okay. The issue of fixation on certification, and this is a domination by other people's agenda. Okay. We are professional educators. Our business is to support learning, fundamentally and primarily. However, we are in the institution that credit on certify. And of course, we have to obey that. But as educators, we should not take our eye away from assessment. So, this distortion, this conflicting interests sometimes cause challenges to us. Okay? These distortions sometimes create changes to where we apply our energy. So one of the questions that sometimes I ask, how is your effort distributed throughout the semester? So does it bulk up toward the end? Or do you have an early peak? Okay? And then a big peak at the end? It's just my question. I'm not judging how you conduct the assessment, but I suggest that if we rethink our assessment strategy, we might have our energy being applied in a certain way of creating that kind of learning that aligned with our understanding of assessment. Is our understanding of assessment referred to certification? If that's so, our strategy, our assessment strategy will show it. Okay, now we also have the term of fixation on measurement. We got this measurement metaphor. Some people even have this belief that assessment is measurement. Assessment, as you know, it is not measurement. Okay, the term assessment as measurement came in early 70s. It is influenced by what we call as the technical innovation in assessment. So people from psychometric background, they look up our teaching practices and they say, hey, we got a solution for you. We got this thing of what we call as assessment practices. We can make them look scientific. We have nice vocabulary for you to use. We have the word reliability, validity. We have technology for it. And we got wonderful thing. We have multiple choice. We have objective tests and so on. So this metaphor of measurement is influencing what we do today. Okay? So by this, what we actually do in assessment is that we are judging the students. We are not nurturing them. Okay? So there is obviously an element of measurement. However, when we make the metaphor of measurement become too dominant, we are privileging things that are not important. And of course, we know that assessment influence what being assessed. Assessment influence what being measured, particularly when we got a sort of active human being that is subject to this, and that fits back to what students do and what they regard as important. So, okay, now let's look into the future. Of course, we know, we admit future is unknown. And of course, it is intrinsically and necessarily unknowable to us. And the unknowability create constraint in what we do, how we prepare our students and create possibilities as well. Okay? We are preparing our students for a changing world, and unfortunately the pace of changing is not decreasing. So whatever else that we do as educators, we should prepare the students for the unknown. We should build their capacity to learn. We should think about how we can use assessment in the context in which some of the knowledge to be assessed is actually unknown to us yet. So this creates an interesting dynamic. So what it implies for what we do in our assessment. Okay, I would like to suggest that we need to think very clearly about assessment. One of the situation is when we use the word assessment to mean two different things. Not only that they are different, they are almost sometimes contradictory. So what we have is that we have the notion of assessment for certification. And when we do assessment for certification, when is the best time to have assessment for certification? Assessment for certification is all about declaring of what students can do. So it should be at the end. but let's have our priority right. For certification, we want, is that a good time to assess students for learning purposes? So the answer is, of course, no. If we want to do assessment for learning, we got to do it earlier. And not just early at the beginning of our program, but early in the semester. I want to suggest that it is almost completely waste of time giving the students information on tasks they don't complete to the end of the semester, and in which they do not have opportunity to correct it again. Okay. I think it's completely a waste of time. Not only our time, the students' time also. We should deploying that time in more useful ways for learning. I got this tension about timing when we should use the assessment. Another tension that we got is that what kind of data or information that we provide to the students. Does assessment for certification helpful to assist students' learning? I do believe that it is completely worthless. Why? Because what information can the students get by getting an A, or by getting a B, or by getting a 70? How they can do differently upon receiving that grades? It got tiny information content, not zero, but tiny. This actually not going to help students do better next time around. So, for learning purposes, the students need information that allow them to change what they do so that they can do it more effectively when they are in the situation again. Okay, so where we are at the moment. So this slide try to show us the history of assessment. It's quite difficult, but the point I am trying to say is that assessment is not the same as what it was in the past, and surely it wouldn't be the same in the future. Assessment is changing tasks. We have what we call as conventional assessment, that is basically testing what you taught, very unreflective, very kind of taking for granted, and it's just about what teachers did. So that is conventional assessment, no technology with it. And that is kind of baseline from what the concept of assessment rooted. Then we have the educational measurement revolution in the 70s, where we have this normal distribution, the normal curve, the bell curve, the obsession to this normal curve that forced us as educators to fail some of the students in order to meet that bell curve. Where we are at the moment is that we gotta focus on competence, a more holistic way of competence, that is authenticity, the idea that is relevant to the students, and there is a significant movement to attribute such as transferable skills. We are grappling on this at the moment, and we are grappling on things like constructive alignment. So that were things at the moment of on assessment. So What I want to highlight is that we are actually moving to a notion of assessment that is about building students' capacity to make judgment about their work. So, what are the shifts in assessment thinking that we've been through so far? I think in the first decade of the 21st century, we've probably seen more activity in change of assessment front at higher education. This is a rapidly moving area. So the shift that we have so far is a shift from teacher-centered to learning-centered approach. Then we move from the notion of testing knowledge, which is a narrow way to assess the students, to judging outcomes that refers to a wider capacity that our graduates were able to do. We've moved from the notion of assessing subject to judging professional capabilities, and we move from the idea of testing the students to the idea of producing learners. And this is the important one. We call our students into the existence as learners by the way we assess them. We create our students by assessment practices. And if we do not like the students we create, a lot of that is due to what we have done in the way we assess them. So, where we are at the moment, we move into a situation in which assessment is based on explicit standard. One of the most scary assessment project that we have is that we are developing an international assessment standard for each discipline area to be used by countries all over the world. Okay, but we are also moving to the next agenda. Okay, although there is nothing wrong with existing agenda where we are trying to have high quality constructive alignment notion and feedback, and we have the agenda of assessment of graduate attributes. However, we are moving towards the next agenda. So we got this two purpose of assessment, and then there is for certification, for aiding supporting current learning of the students. But as David Bao said, I would like to again highlight the need to add a third purpose of assessment, not only because it is intrinsically different from formative assessment, but recognizing it to have a different purpose. And the purpose is to foster lifelong learning, sustainable learning, learning beyond graduation, which is known as sustainable assessment. By the term sustainable assessment, it means that the assessment that meet the need of the present learning and also prepare students to meet their own future learning. So it moves from a focus on disciplinary knowledge to what students can do in the world. Okay? So we need to make sure that the assessment that we use helps students to make judgment about their work. So that is a term of sustainable for the students. But I receive many view from the educators saying that it is not sustainable to them because the amount of work that they have got is burden, but is very challenging. So yeah, it is sustainable for the students, and it should be sustainable for the educators. And well, I want to say that the notion of sustainable assessment would never increase educator workload, but it will substantially influence how we distribute our assessment work. Okay? So, sustainable assessment, it is assessment that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of students to meet their own future learning needs. So, is reliability the most important thing that we need to worry? Is validity the most important thing that we need to worry about? Well, I don't think so. The most important thing that we have to worry about is the effect of our assessment practices has on what students do, how they study, and what they learn. When we are confident that our assessment practices help the students to be productive, then I'm sure we are in a good track. We need to position students as active learners. Okay, always. So, by developing their capacity to make judgment about their learning, include that of others, and this helps build students' capacity beyond the course. So, is this what we are producing? So, I think I will leave you with that point to ponder. With that, thank you very much for having me, and stay safe, everybody.
much. One, promoting the strength and values of cultural diversities, promoting human rights and respect for who are different from oneself, and also promoting alternative life choice for people, uh, promoting social justice and equal opportunities for all people, and also promoting equity in the distribution of power among groups. We could see that uh, from previous understanding about ESD, most of the definitions of ESD are focusing on sustainable development. Even our keynote speaker earlier mentioned about the sustainability and of education, uh, focusing on the environment issues. Whereas for the multicultural education, and of course for the whole system of education, we are focusing on, as been mentioned by Durkheim, the aim is to create a well-being society. That's why, next slide, please. Next slide. Right. So, the main idea of multiculturalism and ESD should be, as been suggested by the International Policy Development of the UNESCO, which aims to support the goals of education, include the United Nations Decades of Education for Sustainable Development, And the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is now focusing on the goal 4.7, stimulates that by 2020 we must ensure that all learners, as shown in the slide here, acquired knowledge and skill needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable peace and non-violence, global citizens, and appreciation of cultural diversities and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. Right. Meaning that nowadays UNESCO also have a shift from focusing on the sustainable of education, mainly were much more focusing on environmental issues. But nowadays, for the agenda 2030, the ideas and the targets or the goals for the